On today's episode of Locked On Canadiens, we talk Habs history with Mike Commito, author of Habs 365.
You're Locked On Canadiens, your daily podcast on the Montreal Canadiens, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to episode 1176 of Locked On Canadiens. Thanks for making us your first listen of the day, for subscribing on YouTube, and wherever you subscribe to podcasts. Doing that supports the show and ensures you don't miss an episode. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win that $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. I'm Ian Boisvert, also known as @MaybeIt'sIan. I am joined, as I always am, by the incomparable Laura Saba, also known as the Actor Stick. And today we are joined by a hockey historian. You know him as the author of Hockey 365, Leafs 365, and now Habs 365. He is also the winner of the Paul Kitchen Award from the Society of International Hockey Research. Please welcome back to the show, Mike Commito. Mike, thanks for taking the time to chat with us. How are you doing today?
Doing well. Thanks for having me again. Appreciate it, guys.
Yeah, no, I know you and Laura have known each other, so it's nice to meet you in person as well. The book, everybody should pick up the book, Habs 365. I think the place we want to start with, because it caught our attention right off the rip, was the proclamation as soon as the book opens that you are not a Canadiens fan, and in fact, you are a Toronto Maple Leafs fan from Sudbury, Ontario. How does a Leafs fan go through the process of writing a book about one of their most bitter rivals in the Montreal Canadiens?
Yeah, so that was, again, I had to, it was like a little bit of a throat clearing in the book, because I think obviously, Leafs 365 came out last year. So obviously it was pretty apparent that the team that I cheer for, it's, oftentimes I'm talking about I've written about them. And so I felt as though it was important just to reemphasize that, again, this is not necessarily my team, but I think going into the process was checking all that baggage at the door, because like what I quickly realized, and one of the things I talked about in the intro of the book, is that no Habs fan is going to want to read a book about the Montreal Canadiens if it's written from the perspective of a Maple Leafs fan. And there's a couple stories, I think, towards the end of the book where I acknowledge and kind of let my allegiances come through. But if every story about the Habs that featured the Leafs was me kind of, taking the Leafs side and telling the story from that perspective, like that's going to get old pretty quick. And so I think as a historian, I've been trained to try to do my best to interpret the facts as best I can on the research that I do, and then, tell the story from my own perspective. And so obviously I know that as a historian, my perspective is going to be different from somebody else and somebody else reading the book. But ultimately I felt as though to really kind of do, proper justice to the franchise, which again, may not have been something that I'd grown up with as a fan, but always a team that had been a big part of my life growing up watching Hockey Night in Canada. My father-in-law is a huge Habs fan, so I leaned on him, for some stories, and then certainly borrowed his jacket when I did the author photo for the inside of the book, which I feel I'm not a Habs fan yet, but I do, that jacket does look pretty sharp, so I have to say that.
Yeah, that's a killer jacket. That thing ruled.
Yeah. It's at least 30 years old for sure. So it's pretty vintage. So definitely hold on to that one for sure.
So as a Canadiens fan, I think we often get accused of living in the past simply because obviously there hasn't been a cup here in a while. And so I'm curious as to, like, when you're a Leafs fan and you kind of have that same accusation, and obviously like there's the taunts and everything like that, like, do you kind of, when you're writing this and you're researching this, do you have a newfound appreciation for the team that you love, or do you find that it's even more frustrating? Because for me, what I know, I went through the book looking for happy moments. I literally thumbed through like dates where I knew it was a good moment, just because the Habs right now are not making me happy.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely what I felt when I did Leafs 365 last year. Because again, I think as a Leafs fan, it's been a very long time, since we've had a championship or anything that we can even, last year, I think when I was writing the book, getting to second round was like the Stanley Cup for that 1 year, right? Which tells you everything you need to know about what it's like to be a Leafs fan in this era. And so I think after going through a book like that, as a fan of that team, and you go through all the highs and the lows, you revisit some of the trades that you wish you could take back, you revisit some of the games that you wish you could have not seen. And then I think what you're left with, though, is that in order to, I think, fully appreciate those good moments and those moments that you still cherish, you have to go through the bad, right? And I think that's kind of what I try to tell myself as a fan, and I'm sure, Canadians these days are themselves as well, that this is all worth it at some point. And so it may not seem like it right now, but getting through the season, getting through some of these games, that if that leads to another moment down the road where you're celebrating, a big victory or ideally that championship, hopefully all that pain, all that suffering, all that anguish, that is, you'll get to that cathartic moment and it all is released. So certainly that's how I felt, I think, when I did the Leafs book, that it really gave me, made me, I think, fully understand like why I still come back to that team every year and why I continue to cheer for that team. I think when I was doing this book, what it definitely did was make me better appreciate the Canadiens and everything that they've done. Certainly, I think, as a kid growing up in Canada, and especially as a bitter rival of the team that I grew up cheering for, I think they always were obviously loomed large in, the hockey landscape. But I think to really go through the history, get to know some of the players that may not have been household names for me necessarily, and obviously the players that were legends that I was already familiar with, just to get a better appreciation of that, I think does kind of make me appreciate more, what the franchise has been able to do, and again, and why they also have such a loyal fan base, and why, despite, maybe the darker days or the rebuild days right now, that, they're still locked in, just the way that we all are with our teams.
So I will say that with Hockey 365, both the first one and the second one, I bought them as Christmas gifts for people. And now I'm really, really excited to shove Canadiens history into their faces with this book. And I do recommend it as a Christmas gift. Like it does go over really well. And we are in the season now and we're trying to plan that stuff. So I do have a couple questions too. I know we're going to get into, the choosing everything in the second segment, but I did want to kind of ask you, was there anything about the Canadiens that really surprised you? As a hockey historian, you probably you're immersed in a lot of Canadiens lore, right? But was there anything that really surprised you when you were going through the research for this book?
That's a great question, because I think, not to say that like nothing surprises me. I think it's more of it, not necessarily anything about, I guess, collectively about the team, but I think just getting a better appreciation, a better understanding for some of the players that you may not have known, some of those stories in detail, right? And so it's like those little things that I found that really, I think, just kind of surprised me. And so I think there's quite a few moments like that. I think also just being able to talk to some of the players that are part of these stories and getting their inside perspective, I think is great, that you can't necessarily glean, from going through old newspapers or going through old books. So I think just talking to some players and getting their firsthand perspectives. But yeah, I think a lot of the book, you'll, as a fan, the target market is like, a lot of these stories are going to ring true for you, especially with some of the bigger names. But I think hopefully, because ultimately I think there's so much history there, and you could probably fill several volumes of this book. And this is we'll start with one. We'll see where that goes, but certainly there's a lot to go around.
Indulge our listeners for just a moment. Is there a moment as a Leafs fan in the book that you wrote about that still burns you, that still you still haven't gotten over after all of these years? Because I can think of a bunch as a Canadiens fan living in Connecticut of the Bruins. The Bruins have done that to me my entire life. Like, is there anything that the Canadiens did to you personally that you are still upset about?
Well, there's two. It's from the ones that I can think of that I kind of inserted narrative into that. That was, like I said earlier, my father-in-law is a diehard Habs fan. Distinctly being at his house one night, well, I guess this is over. I'm like, you, sir, are clearly not a Leafs fan. This is far. Comes back and forces Game 7 and wins that game. And he asked if I wanted to watch it with him, and I said absolutely not. I've been through enough Game 7s as a Leafs fan that those are games you watch by yourself in the basement with the lights off. So I wasn't going to subject him to that. So that was one. But I think that whole series, I think there was one story in there, especially with I forget which game it was, when Alex Galchenyuk makes, in the book I write, like the most ill-advised cross-ice pass of his career, right? Which ultimately leads to the goal, and then like here we are, right? So there's those moments for sure. I think 2021 is probably the one that I think of the most, just because of, I don't think the two teams had ever played each other in the playoffs in my lifetime up until that point. I think the last time was in the 70s, late 70s. I never really appreciated. There's obviously like those regular season moments. I've got that moment. You can see Max Domi from the bench. And you don't have to be a lip reader to know what he's saying to Kapanen. And so I put that story in there just because I think as a Leafs fan, regardless of the outcome of what ended up happening, that's a pretty pretty funny moment.
Yeah, no, that's a great one for sure. All right, we have to move on to our second segment. When we come back, maybe we'll dive into some of the parts of Habs history that we might want to forget. There's a few of those throughout the book, I'm sure, and we're going to get into all that in just a moment. If you need to hire, you need Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find candidates fast. Ditch the busy work, use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with candidates faster. And Indeed doesn't just help you hire faster, 93% of employers agree Indeed delivers the highest quality matches compared to other job sites, according to a recent Indeed survey. And that's one of the things I like the most about Indeed, the confidence that you will not only fill the position quickly, but that the candidates you are matched with will be high quality matches. And listeners of the show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Today's episode is also brought to you by FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place your live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. All right, we are back with Mike Commito, author of Habs 365. I don't want to put you on the spot, Mike, but this episode will release on November 5th. Do you happen to remember what the entry is for November 5th in the book?
Well, like a good author, I always keep a copy of the book nearby me at all times, even when I'm driving, just in case. But yeah, November 5th was when the Canadiens signed David Desharnais in 2008. So that one we get to talk about, like, obviously, you know, his a bit of an unlikely path, you know, to the NHL, you know, him doing very well in the ECHL and the AHL, and then obviously getting into the Habs. And then kind of highlighting a little bit of his career, you know, from that point on. Again, even for somebody like me who, you know, at the time when he was kind of, you know, in his heyday in the league, like he was somebody that, you know, I had a rooting interest in just because I think it was so, you know, cool to see him go from where he was and then ultimately become a mainstay on the team, you know, for the next several years and ultimately later on, you know, with the Rangers. And so it's good that that's a story for that day, because the day that we're talking is the anniversary of, you know, the 10-0 loss. Yes. The Blue Jackets in 2016. So you've got the good and the bad, right? You've got a nice story. You can bring back memories of David Desharnais, and then the day before that, you can, you know, revisit the cannon going off 10 times at Nationwide Arena.
Yeah, and I bring that up because I think it illustrates the balance that you have in this book, because then I believe the day after the Desharnais day is Bernie Geoffrion scoring his 100th goal. So it's just the whiplash you might get as a Canadiens fan here is really fun. Like, I was reading through it and going, oh, cool. Oh, that's terrible. Wait, that one's cool. You know, was that important to you in writing this to you know, not give just, you know, the same kind of rosy look we always get at Canadiens history, because the more recent aspects of it are not always great. Obviously, there's that 10-0 loss. You know, they are the first team in NHL history to finish 32nd overall. You know, so there's a recent history that's not super great here. How important was it for you to balance those things?
What I picked up on that was that it was important, I think, to try to balance it out, knowing that I'm going to have a bunch of different people reading the book, from a variety of fans reading it, people that are trying to get into the team right now and maybe looking for reasons to look back, you know, in history and some of the more, I guess, rosy stories. But I think I like the whiplash, you know, effect that you mentioned, because again, I don't think that's necessarily intentional to have you kind of go so all over the map with some of the stories, but I think that's just kind of one of the fun aspects of doing this book. Whereas as a historian, you know, there's a lot of moments where I'm trying to actively pick what knowing that you can't do that for everything, right? And you have to kind of try to appeal to a broad, you know, base of readers. And so there's days when, you know, Eric Cole high-fiving the referee after scoring a goal is maybe not the that happened on March 14th, but it's a pretty fun story. And I think ultimately balancing out some of the bad with some of the stories that, maybe obviously wouldn't make it into a history book necessarily, but something that fans still remember, I think is really important as well.
So unlike Ian, who said he didn't want to put you on the spot, I actually do want to put you on the spot. So my question to you is, when you had a choice, right? There are some days where lots of things happen, particularly when it's in season, right? Like the off season is a little bit harder to kind of find things to talk about. But when you were faced with, let's say, 10 good things and one bad thing, like how do you as a Leafs fan resist the urge to just dump in that like negative story when you have so many to choose from?
Well, I think it goes back to the early comments in the introduction that, again, if I were to do that, you as a Habs when you book, right? So I think knowing that I truly do wanted to write a book for Habs fans to the best of my abilities as somebody who didn't necessarily grow up bleeding blue, white, and red, and so I think and there wasn't necessarily too many moments where I'm like, I'm not going to do that because like that's not. That's a story that I would write if I was writing a book, about the Leafs, really. But I think it's just trying to think of what I think is the story that's going to resonate as much as I can, right? And knowing that, like, me thinking, like, for example, that is not something my father-in-law is going to necessarily remember from that day or thing. It's hopefully a book for many people, especially Habs fans, and so I think just trying to be as open as I can with trying to select some of those stories. And knowing that, yes, some of those bad stories have to be told. We have to talk about some trades that didn't work out that Montreal would like to maybe take back. But again, to do like 10 of those in a row, that's not going to really make you want to keep reading on. And so I think it's important that, that's where the editors come in, and not that it came up, but I think that's where somebody else with a different set of eyes can say, hey, you know what, this is we're kind of trending in the wrong direction in this particular month. And so let's maybe get this back on the rails. And so I think just trying to tell as much as I can, for the fans, from the good, the bad. So I kind of approached it with all of the Hockey 365 books, is that try the uplifting stories, but I'll definitely make sure that you don't forget about this one trade that you may like to. But ultimately, it's there. It's part of the team's history. So we've got to include it in some way.
So I have a question for my co-host, actually, and then you can ask it back if you want. When you received your copy of the book, what is the first thing you looked for?
June 29th, 2016. It was the first date I went to because it's the one that's always in my head. That's the PK Subban trade. And I remember correctly, I think I went a day or two within that range, and the Ryan McDonagh trade was also right there. Like, we should just disappear for the month of June. There should be nothing that month.
Do you know what's really funny? Sorry, I was just going to say that was the first thing I looked for too, even before checking for it was 3-1. The first thing I looked for was the PK Subban trade. Is it in this thing?
Yeah, had to be.
Yeah, and then I think I'm just looking at it right now, and yes, I did. I didn't mention that, but it is the same day that they. Oh no, I did mention that. Sorry, that it's the same day that they traded Chelios as well, right? So the actual same day, but 20 years earlier or whatever it was at the time, and so. You've got that trade, and then later you got the PK trade, and then you're right. The next day is the anniversary of the which again, in hindsight, love to that might have looked a little bit differently, but at the time, they obviously had their reasons, and we now know the player that Ryan McDonagh became.
Yeah. I think the thing you should take away from that as a Canadiens fan is wait until July 1st to buy a jersey. But that'll end it for this segment. When we come back, we are going to do what we always do on the show and try to remember some guys, and we'll get into that in just a minute. This episode is brought to you by PrizePicks. PrizePicks is America's #1 daily fantasy sports app with over 5 million active members. PrizePicks is the easiest, most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. All you do is pick more or less on 2 to 6 player stat projections and watch the winnings roll in. PrizePicks puts their members first, so all withdrawals are fast, safe, and secure. When my picks hit, I can get my money in as quick as 15 minutes. PrizePicks invented the flex play, which means you can still cash out if your lineup isn't perfect. You can double your money, even if one of your picks doesn't hit. It's so fun and simple, you'll really enjoy playing. Download the PrizePicks app today and use code LOCKEDONNHL to get $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONNHL on PrizePicks to get $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup. You don't even need to win to receive the $50 bonus. It's guaranteed. PrizePicks, run your game. All right, we are in the home stretch here, Mike. We thank you so much for your time, and thanks everybody for tuning into this one. We like to remember guys. It's one of our favorite things. One of the segments that we've done lately is doing some trivia and having some fun with those answers. This one's a little less of trivia. Now that you have sort of a really good perspective on the history of the Montreal Canadiens over the summer, Ken Dryden kicked off a bit of a storm when he suggested that Carey Price's number should hang from the rafters at the Bell Center. From a historian perspective, right? We've gotten the fan perspective, we've gotten the Ken Dryden greatness perspective. From the perspective of a historian, how does it make you feel to think that Carey Price might be the last Canadian to wear the number 31? Does that feel right?
Well, I think especially I'm going to always defer to Ken Dryden. I think more or less when it comes to, his perspectives on history and the play of goaltenders. But again, I couldn't agree more. I know ultimately, I think we often look at, if a player, and I think this is oftentimes something that I often rail against, that especially when we get into Hockey Hall of Fame debates, is whether or not that player had won a championship. I think you just have to look at what he did for the franchise and how valuable he was. If you think of the Hart trophies, you think of the Vezes, and you think of just what he meant to that franchise, on and off the worldly play for that stretch where he was arguably the best goaltender on. Not that I think I have this book to remind me of that. I think going into the book, I always kind of knew where I kind of had Carey Price in the Mount Rushmore of Canadiens goalies, and I think ultimately within the larger context of NHL goalies, that he's ultimately one of the greatest to ever play the game. And so I think I'd love to see that. Again, I know surprising that might be for some fans, but certainly I think actually I will say one of back to Carey Price. And again, I do remember this as well when it was happening, that after that run, in 2010, there were some people that thought that they traded the wrong goalie. And then even going into the season the following year, he's getting booed in preseason. Ultimately, within a few short years, I think he's quite vindicated, and the people that had supported him were vindicated of the choices they made. But it's interesting now when you think of the entire his entire time with the franchise to where he is now to where he was, in 2010 when people thought they should have kept Halak. It's interesting. And again, not that you forgot, Habs fans probably remember that whole saga, but I think just going back and kind of reliving the series and those runs in 2010, and then ultimately, his position is, for me, it's unquestioned. But certainly, I think that's a debate that's going to be interesting to see as it kind of picks up steam, and maybe we see that happening.
Yeah, the Halak aspect of that hung over the team for a while. We would, and Laura's smiling and nodding because I think she knows that, the post-game coverage that, for Canadiens games, when Price had a bad game, you knew people were going to call in and see if there was any way they could trade for Yaroslav Halak again, even though he was on his fifth team after, coming to the Canadiens. So yeah, that's always an interesting aspect of this. And it's funny, you mentioned that quickly after that, he turned it around. That season, the preseason where he got booed, he told everybody to chill out. And then that was his breakout season, right? He's got ice in his veins. He said, everybody in this city needs to chill out. And then he had that was the beginning of the Carey Price era. I couldn't imagine a different way for that to start. As far as we'll keep talking about some guys that we remember. Do you have a favorite Leaf that also played for the Montreal Canadiens? Is there someone that wore both sweaters that you kind of look back on and you say that was my guy?
Oh, well, that's a really good question. I have just off the top of my head. I do. So Doug Gilmour was my mom's favorite player when he was. I think she was. Well, I don't think she's told me many times that she was very attracted to Doug, but it was definitely Doug Gilmour. And so obviously for me as a Leafs fan, when he was, in his heyday with the Leafs, that's, the playoff runs that I remember watching, staying up late, trying to watch, them play in that 93 run against the Kings. I think I maybe got through a little bit of the game and then woke up in my bed the next morning and had to get the rundown from my folks. But ultimately Gilmour playing for both Toronto and Montreal is one, I think from the younger fan perspective, is somebody that looms large for me. But certainly, you know, there's been a few over the years. I'm trying to think of who else might have been featured in the book. I do believe, I'm just trying to think if I included any other stories like that, where I don't think I mentioned exactly if they tap into my league. I would say that if I had to pick one, it's probably Gilmore.
Yeah. I've just been looking back on like old hockey DB pages, and I keep looking and seeing Thomas Plekanec played for the Maple Leafs, and it still makes me a little upset that he didn't play all of his games in Montreal. Laura, do you have an answer for this? Is there a favorite for you?
I mean, you know, I think it's funny. Like, I think the Thomas Caberlet one is really funny. And so like that's like my favorite story, right? But I think if we have to count Plekanec, it's Plekanec. But I think also one thing that I did want to point out, since we're remembering some dudes, sorry to take it on a tangent, was that I was really like amused to see that Douglas Murray made it into this book, which is not someone I was expecting to see in a Habs history book, I have to tell you.
And the funny thing about him was, I think that's, you know, to your earlier, you know, question, Laura, that those are some of those examples where like I didn't know this, and like so like having Douglas Murray in there, I think I talked about how like when I was younger, like in my younger days, I never thought that Douglas Murray was Swedish. I just assumed that he was like from, you know, with a name like Douglas Murray, just never crossed my mind. I remember at some point realizing that he was not, in fact, maybe who I thought he was. It's like, okay, that's interesting. So I included that nugget just to kind of acknowledge that obviously, you know, we all make mistakes. But then the interesting thing that I found in reading that story was that, you know, his nickname was not that surprising if you've seen Douglas Murray. But the thing that really did surprise me beyond learning that nickname, which I may not have known earlier, was that when he was going to school, he went to an Ivy League school, that they had patented like this keg tap for beers. And I think they're still doing well, him and his buddies, with this piece of technology that they've I guess they obviously still have been able to commercialize. And so again, it does make sense now when you think of somebody named Crankshaft who went to Ivy League, who's obviously going to come up with, you know, a way to more efficiently tap into it. But I think that was one of those moments where I'm like, I knew Douglas Murray, I knew what he did, you know, as a blue liner throughout his time in the NHL. But that piece of his story off the ice was one of those fun moments where you may not know that until you actually are forced to write, you know, a little story about Douglas Murray in a book about the Montreal Canadiens.
I think Canadians, at least the people who listen to this show, will love the deep cut that is Douglas Murray. Mike, that we're running out of time today, so we want to thank you for taking the time to meet with us this evening. Tell people where they can find you and find the book.
Sure. Yeah, no, thanks, guys. I appreciate it. Ian and Laura, thanks for having me on. It's been a treat. As for where you can find the book, you can get the book from wherever you like to buy books. It's available on Amazon, Indigo in Canada. You can also buy directly from the publisher, Dundurn Press. But if you'd like to support independent bookstores, you can always ask them to order it in for you if they don't already have it in stock. And you find me, I'm probably tweeting or whatever we're calling it these days about the book quite a bit on Twitter at Mike Commito, on all social media platforms with that same handle. And yeah, it's that's pretty much my main focus these days, is just trying to we're kind of turning the page over, thinking about Christmas. I know it's a little bit early still, but not too early. So you can find me, and that's where you can find the book.
Awesome. Well, thanks for your time, Mike. That's going to do it for us on today's episode of Locked On Canadiens. Thanks for making Locked On Canadiens your first listen today. For your second listen, find Locked On Fantasy Hockey. Become a fantasy hockey expert and get the edge over your league mates with daily tips from Steal and Flip. Find Locked On Fantasy Hockey on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can follow the show on Twitter at LO_Canadiens or email us at lockedoncanadiens@gmail.com. You can find Laura at The Actor Stick. You can find me at Maybe It's Ian. Thanks for listening. We'll see you tomorrow.